In today's video, Magnus Carlsen shocks Praggnanandhaa with some brutal attacking chess in the Grunfeld Defense at the 2022 Charity Cup Prelims. Now, in the game, everyone's favorite chess Indian superstar, or at least mine, Praggnanandhaa, he opens 1d4, standing on the queen side, and Magnus goes one knight to f6, the Indian defense. Oh, the irony. Now here Pragg, c4 on the board, and g6 for Magnus. Now we have knight to c3, and instead of bishop g7 heading for a king's Indian defense, here Magnus does go d5, and this is the Grunfeld defense. Now the main idea behind this opening is you do give white a very large pawn center in the middle of the board if he wants it. For example, white can take on d5 and then go e4, getting a very large pawn center. However, Magnus will have very good counterattacking chances against the center if that is what Pragg does go for. And in the game, Pragg does go for the exchange variation. So, c takes d5 on the board. This is the main line. Here, Magnus takes back on d5. Then we have e4 trying to drive back the knight. Now, the main move is knight takes c3. That is what Magnus does. You don't want to go back knight to f6 or knight b6. Those moves are just too passive. So instead, knight takes c3 on the board. Then b takes c3, and Magnus goes bishop g7. And this is the real starting point of the exchange variation. Here, Praggnanandhaa has a very strong pawn center with the pawns on c3, d4, and e4. However, Magnus will be able to counterattack against those pawns with moves like c5, knight c6, maybe even queen to a5, and bishop g4. So the battle lines are drawn. Pragg's going to try to prove that his pawn center is a huge asset, while Magnus will try to attack it with everything he's got. Now in the game, Pragg starts knight to f3, a very solid idea. c5 for Magnus. Very important to go c5 before castles. If you don't do that, you will be in a lot of trouble. So c5, the key move, attacking that center immediately. And now here Pragg, he goes for one of Magnus Carlsen's new favorite weapons against the Grunfeld defense. He starts bishop to e3. And this bishop e3 variation of the exchange variation of the Grunfeld has become insanely popular at the highest level. The idea being you want to go queen d2, potentially setting up bishop to h6 threats in the future. And beyond that, you're just staying flexible with the pawns in the middle of the board, and you may want to play on either the king side or the queen side, depending on how the game develops. Now here in this position, the main line is queen to a5. However, instead of that, Magnus plays a new line that has become insanely trendy at the highest level. He goes bishop g4, immediately putting pressure on that knight on f3. Of course, now the knight is pinned to the queen on the d1 square. And with that knight pinned, that means black is putting increased pressure on that pawn on d4, as the knight won't be able to recapture on d4 in the future. So very interesting idea by Magnus. And now here Praggnanandhaa, what does he do about it? In the game, he goes rook to c1, a very standard idea in this line. The idea being the rook is better placed on the c-file, and you're also stepping out of this long diagonal here. Of course, that bishop was putting x-ray pressure on the rook. For example, if these pawns started flying off the board, say c takes, then d5, that rook on a1 could be vulnerable. So rook c1, a very good multi-purpose move in this line. Now here, Magnus at castles. Pragg goes bishop e2, a very interesting idea. Typically in this line, you are going to go queen d2 before bishop e2, but funnily enough, Praggnanandhaa has a very specific idea in mind for this game. All right, Magnus, queen to a5 on the board, a typical idea in the exchange variation of the Grunfeld. Now he has pressure on that pawn on c3, is now pinned to the king, and beyond that, of course, he's also pressuring that very weak pawn on the a2 square. Queen takes a2 is now a threat, and what is Praggnanandhaa going to do about it? Well, one idea here is simply queen d2, defending the pawn on a2 with the queen. However, Praggnanandhaa, he came prepared. It is a much more aggressive idea in mind. Here in this position, he does not defend the pawn on a2 at all. He simply castles on the king side, giving up that pawn on a2 to Magnus if he wants it. And Magnus, he's ready for a fight. He does not want to go knight d7 or e6 or any other solid move. He just takes that pawn on a2, bringing the fight to Praggnanandhaa. And now we're going to have an absolute dogfight on our hands. All right, here Pragg expands in the center with the move d5. The idea being now c takes d4 is no longer a threat. Pragg is going to maintain that pawn center on d5 and e4 for a very long time. However, now Magnus Carlsen again gives up one pawn, and he has that pass pawn on the a file, and the b pawn is also very, very strong. Magnus Carlsen in this position, his plan is just pushing those pawns down the board as fast as he can. Meanwhile, Pragg may have to start an attack on the king side to prove compensation for the missing pawn. Now, in this position, that pawn on c5 is being attacked by the bishop. That is one of the ideas of d5. Therefore, knight d7 is the move for Magnus Carlsen, by far the strongest idea. Just defending the pawn on c5 with the knight for now and staying very, very flexible. Now here Pragg, he decides it is time to put the question to the bishop. He goes h3, challenging the bishop, And where is the bishop going to go? After knight d7, obviously bishop d7 and bishop c8 are not possibilities, and staying on this diagonal in general is just not a good idea. Therefore, bishop takes f3 is forced here, so we have bishop takes f3 from Magnus, and now here, Pragg. Which piece should he recapture with? The bishop or the g-pawn? If you thought the bishop, that's a very reasonable idea. However, it's not the strongest idea in this position, and it's also not the move that Pragg made in this game. Here, instead of bishop takes f3, Pragg actually recaptures with the g-pawn. G takes f3. Now, what is the idea behind this move? Well, it's very simple. Here again, Pragg is down a pawn, and he has to generate some sort of attacking chances against the black king, and recapturing with the g-pawn actually helps him do that. Now, an idea maybe, for example, f4 to f5, trying to open up lines on the king side, and this g-pawn could be a battering ram in the future. So, very good idea by Pragg, not very easy to find. He came prepared for this game against Magnus Carlsen. All right, now, queen to a5 on the board for Magnus. The idea being the queen is very vulnerable on the a2 square. For example, rook to a1 and rook c2 may have been coming next for Pragg. So queen to a5, a good move, setting up queen c7 ideas if you need to retreat the queen further. Now here Pragg, that pawn on c3 is being attacked by both the queen and the bishop. Therefore, bishop takes f3 is a real threat. What is Pragg going to do about it? Well, here Pragg has a few different ideas. The main move, of course, is going to be trying to defend the pawn with the queen. Now, what are the options? For example, queen c2, queen d2, and queen d3 are all very playable. Now, queen d2 is the move Pragg made in the game. That is the most natural idea. Of course, you are making that battery with the queen and the bishop on this diagonal, setting up bishop to h6 ideas. However, queen d3 was actually the stronger move here, the idea being you need to control those light squares on the queen side. However, after queen d2, Magnus just goes c4, expanding on the queen side, and now the idea being, if you recapture that pawn with the bishop, Magnus will be able to go rook a to c8, and suddenly that open c-file is to Magnus Carlsen's benefit. He has that x-ray pressure on the pawn on c3, c3 will likely fall, and Pragg's whole position will start to collapse. So Pragg here, he does not take that pawn on c4, that is the correct idea. Instead, he goes queen b2, trying to increase the pressure on the queen side, a very good move. Of course, the other idea would have been f4 here, trying to generate an attack on the king side. Instead, with the move queen b2, Pragg is signaling his intention to play on the queen side and to target those weak pawns on b7 and a7. Now here, Magnus, what should he be doing in this position? Well, he finds the strongest idea, simply pushing those pawns on the queen side immediately. He goes b5. Of course, his main long-term idea is to get those pawns rolling on the queen side, so b5 makes perfect sense. But now Pragg, he increases the pressure on the queen side. Rook to a1 on the board, hitting the queen on the a5 square. Where is the queen going to go? Well, he finds the drawback of this move. Of course, the rook no longer defending c3. Therefore, queen takes c3 is a very real threat, and Magnus just jumps in with the queen. So, queen takes c3 on the board. Of course, the drawback of this move is it does leave that pawn on b5 undefended, and that was part of the whole idea of queen d2 and rook c to a1 for Pragg. So now, queen takes b5 on the board, winning the free pawn. Of course, if you take the queen on c3, you're just going to be down a pawn for nothing. That is not a good idea. Instead, queen takes b5 on the board, keeping the queens on the board, and therefore keeping the game very exciting for a very long time here. Now, in this position, Magnus just goes knight to b6, a very solid idea. Of course, that pawn on a7 was now being attacked by both the rook and the bishop, so knight b6 brings the knight over to the queen side, defends the c4 pawn, and blocks the attack on the a7 pawn with the bishop on e3. So very good multi-purpose move by Magnus. Now here Pragg, he goes rook a to c1, increasing the pressure on the c-file and attacking the queen. Where's the queen going to go? In the game, Magnus goes queen to f6, a very good idea. Now the queen is eyeing that h4 square. Queen to h4 could be a threat, and from there he would threaten that pawn on the h3 square. And here Praggnanandhaa, he spots the idea, and he just goes king to g2, a very good preemptive defensive move on the king side, preemptively defending the pawn on h3, and also getting the king off the back rank. Now rook g1 and rook h1 ideas are possible in the future if Pragg needs it. However, Magnus Carlsen, he's not slowing down. He pushes his pawn on the queen side, c3 on the board. And the idea behind this move is very, very simple. Pass pawns must be pushed. That is, of course, a pass pawn, and Magnus is trying to get his a pawns and c pawns rolling in this game. And beyond that, of course, that pawn is supported by both the queen and the bishop. It is going to be safe for a very, very long time. Now here, Pragg, he gets his attack going on the king side with the move f4. A very strong idea. Now Pragg may be threatening e5 in the future or f5 depending on circumstances. But here Magnus, he finds a brilliant response. e5, expanding in the center and blocking the pawn of Pragg. All right, now Praggnanandhaa, he can recapture on e5 or on e6 with the move en passant. Which one does he want to do? Well, first of all, not taking the pawn is not a possibility. Then Magnus just takes on f4 with the pawn and hits the bishop, wins a pawn. That is not good. So instead here, Pragg takes on e6 with the move en passant. A very strong idea. Now after queen takes e6, the move for Pragg is e5, expanding in the center again and trying to lock out that dark squared bishop out of the game. Now look at these bishops. Pragg's bishop on e3, very, very active, slicing across this diagonal, whereas Magnus Carlsen's bishop on g7, not doing very much right now. So that is a very good victory for Pragg. And so far in this game, he is giving Magnus Carlsen the fight of his life. All right, now in this position, Magnus Carlsen, what should he be doing? Well, there are a variety of ideas you could play. Knight d5, very, very playable. Queen d5, also playable. That move will get the queens off the board as the queen on b5 is now being attacked. And beyond that, even the move g5, expanding on the king side and try to deflect the f-pawn away from the defense of the e5 pawn is playable. Instead of those, Magnus goes with the first option, knight d5 on the board. The idea being you centralize the knight, you defend that pawn on c3 with the knight. Of course, e5 blocks out the bishop from defending it. And beyond that, you also put pressure on that bishop on e3. So, knight d5, a typical Magnus Carlsen move, a very good multi-purpose move with lots of different ideas. Now here, Pragg, he goes bishop g4. The idea being simply hitting the queen on e6. Magnus will have to move the queen, but instead of moving it right away, he just jumps in with the knight and takes the bishop. Knight takes e3. Of course, this move hits with check. The king on g2 is under check. Therefore, bishop takes e6 is not possible yet. So, f takes e6 on the board, and now the queen has to move. Where is the queen going to go? In the game, Magnus finds the very active idea, queen to a2, launching the queen down the board and hitting the king on g2 with tempo. Now, rook to f2 from Pragg blocks the attack of the queen and hits the queen with tempo in return. The queen has to move, queen to a3 on the board, and again, Magnus finds a very strong square for the queen. On a3, that queen does support that c3 pawn, and it puts pressure on the rook on the c1 square. Now here, Pragg, rook f to c2. This being one of the other ideas of rook f2 on the prior move. Now the rooks do support each other, and they put a lot of pressure on that pawn on c3, so very good regrouping by Pragg. And Pragg here, he may even be fighting for an advantage due to Black's very poorly placed bishop on the g7 square. All right, Magnus Carlsen, rook a to b8, increasing the pressure on the b file and hitting the queen. Now Pragg, queen c4, getting out of the attack and increasing the pressure on that pawn on the c3 square. Now Magnus, rook b2, flying in with the rook. The idea being, if you take the rook on the b2 square, then queen takes b2 is going to be devastating. That would hit the rook on c1 and the king with check, and that would be game over. You win the rook on the spot. So, rook takes b2 is not a possibility. With that in mind, what should Pragg be doing here? In the game, he goes king to g3, simply getting the king off that second rank where it was very vulnerable and potentially being hit by the rook on b2, so excellent move. But here, Magnus Carlsen, he shows his genius. He finds an unbelievable idea to increase the pressure on the king side. I nearly lost it when I saw this sequence of moves. He starts with the idea h5, expanding on the king side. Very natural move. You drive back the bishop. The bishop goes back to the f3 square. But here in this position, Magnus Carlsen shows why he is the greatest chess player of all time. He goes h4, the alpha 0 pawn on the board, gaining space on the king side, hitting the king with check, and locking in that pawn on the h3 square. Now, the obvious question, can you take the pawn on the h4 square? The answer is technically yes, but is not a good idea. Here, if you go king takes h4, Magnus Carlsen's idea would have been bishop takes e5, an absolutely stunning and brilliant idea. The idea being, if you take the bishop on e5 with f takes e5, then you open up the attack with the rook to b4, pinning the queen to the king on the h4 square. So that is the entire idea of h4 here. If you take the pawn, it's bishop takes, then rook to b4, and that is game over. So king takes b4, not a good idea at all. Instead, king to h2, Praggnanandhaa respects the idea of Magnus Carlsen. He retreats the king, but now Magnus does have that very good pawn wedge on h4. That was a brilliant idea on his part. Now, rook d8, activating the rook, setting up rook d2 ideas. Magnus Carlsen slowly increasing the pressure in this game. His only problem is that bishop on g7, but he is more than compensating for it with his deadly attack with the queens and the rooks and the pawn on c3 against the white king. Now here Praggnanandhaa, he tries to defend. He goes bishop d5, trying to block the open d-file. However, this turns out to be a slight mistake. Here Magnus Carlsen goes king to h7, getting out of the potential attack on that f7 square. Now bishop takes f7 would not hit with check. That was the whole idea of bishop d5 in the first place. And now Pragg, the best idea for him here is going to be bishop f3, just try to retreat the bishop back where it came from. However, he doesn't do that. Instead, he goes king to g1, and this turns out to be an absolutely fatal mistake if Magnus can find the right follow-up. The right sequence of moves here is going to be first rook takes c2. The idea being if the rook takes, you go queen to a1 check, hitting the king, and then you can slide into the d1 square with the queen. That would be absolutely deadly. Now Magnus doesn't find that exact combination in the game. Instead, queen to a5 on the board, and the game continues. But here Pragg, he makes one last big mistake. Again, you have to go bishop f3. Instead, e4 on the board. This move does lock in that bishop on the d5 square, and this is the beginning of the end. Here Magnus, queen to b6, hitting the king. The king has to move, king g2. But now Magnus, queen to e3, infiltrating with the queen in the middle of the board. All right, queen to f1, trying to defend that f4 pawn. But now Magnus, he finally activates that dark squared bishop, bringing the last piece into the game. Bishop to h6. Now the threat is just bishop takes f4, and from there that bishop will be an absolute monster in this game. All right, king to h1, and then bishop takes f4 on the board. Magnus Carlsen, he's done it. He's brought that dark squared bishop back to life, back into the game, and is now one of the strongest pieces in this position. All right, here Pragg, he takes on b2. Rook takes b2 for Praggnanandhaa, but then c takes b2, hits the rook on the c1 square. Rook b1 is forced. You simply cannot allow that pawn to promote on b1, either now or in the future. But now queen g3 for Magnus Carlsen. The audacity, threatening checkmate in one move on the h2 square. What is Praggnanandhaa going to do about it? In the game, he takes on b2, rook takes b2, defending the h2 square with the rook. But now Magnus, rook to c8, the final piece entering the game. Now the threat is simply rook c1, and that would be devastating. Now here Pragg, he tries to find some counterplay with the move e6. This is the best fighting chance. Potentially you can threaten e7, e8, loading to a new queen. But Magnus Carlsen, he is not phased. He does not see ghosts, and he just jumps in with the rook to the c1 square. Rook to c1 on the board. And now look at this. That queen on f1 is pinned to the king on the h1 square. Praggnanandhaa takes the rook. Queen takes c1. And here Magnus Carlsen, does he take the queen right away? No, he adds the disrespect with the move queen takes h3. The king moves, and then he takes on c1. And in this position, being down a queen, Praggnanandhaa resigns on the spot to Magnus Carlsen and his ultra-aggressive Grunfeld opening from this game. Wow, what a game. Alright guys, if you enjoyed this video, go ahead and smash that like button for me. It helps me out so much. Thank you for smashing that like button. And while you're at it, check out this video right here, where Praggnanandhaa sacrifices the rook against Magnus Carlsen on move 7, and then his second rook later in the middle game. That game was unbelievable, featuring Praggnanandhaa and Magnus Carlsen. So check it out, and I'll see you in the next video.